Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm Joshua Haberski, the Executive Director of the Premium Cigar Association. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Glenn Loop, who runs our state advocacy. I think, we're just a little bit over a month into the 2025 state legislative cycles, although I think some of the pre-filings and that, it's starting a lot sooner than it has in the past. And Glenn's been sifting through a deluge of bills and actions protecting brick and mortar small businesses and advancing your interests. Glenn, if you would, for our audience, kind of give us a lay of the land, what's going on in the states. In past, you kind of laid out what's going on in your laundry list, but also if you could touch on a little bit some trends that you're seeing at the state level.
Well, I'm having a flashback, Josh. On I've got a note in front of me on January the 6th. So just right at 30 days ago, 31 days ago, I wrote a memo to you to share with our PCA board of directors. And the memo was to be sort of a crystal ball as to what we were to expect in this current state legislative season. On some fronts, I'm glad the crystal ball said yes, this is going to happen, and on others, we've got a lot of concern. And then on others, we have some anticipation of as to how this can morph into items that are positive or possibly negative for the industry. So I broke down that January 6th memo by region. And now I compare that to hoping everybody goes to cigaraction.org for their state updates. So I'm just bear with me, be patient. I'm going to run through the states. And if anybody's listening from one of these states, either we will have or we do have a notice update petition on cigaraction.org pertaining to these states. Maine, flavor ban and tax proposals. New York, soon there will be a great effort towards reducing the tax burden in the state of New York. This will be about the third run at this, but third time's the charm. Cigar bar legislation, and then some anti cigar legislation coming out of the governor's office on the flavor ban and tax front. And there's at least one tax increase proposal that's already posted on cigaraction.org. Tax cap planning in the state of New Jersey, local authority legislation in the state of Rhode Island, potential flavor legislation returning to the state of Vermont, tax legislation in Delaware, and before I get to the good one, I'll talk about the bad one. The bad one is Massachusetts remaining in the Northeast, generational smoking ban, and tax increase proposals. There's legislation on both sides of the generational smoking ban issue. And as you and I have talked, this is probably the single greatest threat to those enjoying a great cigar in the country. And I'll talk about another part of the country in just a little bit. But in Massachusetts, there's now legislation to make what's been going around statewide, local government, by locality, by township, to make it statewide. There's a rebutting piece of legislation sponsored by the retail merchants and the convenience store interests and some of our tobacco association colleagues to make an across the board statement about what's 21, gaming, alcohol, enjoying a cigar. So we'll have all of those posted on cigaraction.org. The last one in the Northeast is a very positive one, and that is, and we're waiting for a House version of what's been introduced in the Senate, but a cigar bar bill in the state of Maryland. It's probably one of the best thought out bills in the country regarding cigar bars and allowing cigar shops to have a on premises alcohol license. They've had over a 6-month study group that's made up of members of their House of Delegates and Senate and staff. They've had hearings. They're all posted on the Maryland Legislative website. They've really put a great deal of thought into it. There's a lot of positive guardrails that shows that, the proverbial public health impact, no youth access, the ways to set up really the guardrails to make it difficult to challenge that type of a piece of legislation. So we're excited about that process coming forth in the coming week in Maryland. The tax cap bill in Virginia has been relegated to a study, but at least that keeps it on the table. We anticipate some local authority legislation in North Carolina that will prevent local governments from enacting laws and ordinances stronger than that of the state. We'd like to see some tax cap planning in Georgia. And this week, the statewide smoking ban bill again died in Mississippi. So that's the Northeast and the South as we see it right now. Now, the Midwest is another picture. There's a package of anti tobacco legislation in the Michigan legislature on the tax. On the tax and flavor ban front. There could be some cigar bar planning as well in the state of Michigan. While we're on Michigan, I don't know how many people saw this, but the Detroit airport is contemplating a cigar lounge in the airport. We wrote a letter of endorsement of that, and last week, Josh, you and I haven't even had a chance to talk about this, but the director's office at the Detroit airport called, acknowledged our letter, and asked us for the public health data that we referenced in our endorsement letter. So hopefully that project will move forward. Illinois, tax cap planning. Indiana, generational smoking ban legislation introduced in the Midwest. Very concerning, and we're rallying the Indiana retail community to oppose this legislation. In Missouri, local authority legislation on both sides of the debate. Legislation that would allow local governments to enact stronger ordinances than that of the state, and a bill that would prevent local governments from enacting ordinances stronger than that of the state. And Nebraska tax cap planning. A tax cap bill's been introduced in the Nebraska legislature. Our board member Tony Goins did a great job providing testimony to that legislation last week, and we see a positive development evolving there. Likewise, now we move to the western states. This past week, on a almost unanimous vote, legislation capping the tax on cigars in the state of Wyoming. Still got a long ways to go, but a great ally and friend of the industry, Senator Pappas, is spearheading that legislation. It's looking positive in the Senate, and it'll be flipped over to the House shortly. In the last week, it wasn't great news, but it was a great effort. The state of Colorado, we thank Senator Tom Sullivan of the Colorado legislature for again introducing tax ceiling legislation in the state of Colorado. The retailers did a great job providing testimony. Our board member, Mary Gallagher Sarsmack, provided great testimony to this legislation. I played cleanup and provided testimony to the Senate Finance Committee. It died on a 5-4 vote. I'll take 5-4 over a flip-flop, major disappointing type of vote any day of the week. It wasn't lopsided. It wasn't 7-1, 6-3. It was 5-4. So we'll take that as a positive step. And the retailers were even pleased because there was one senator kind of waffling and wavering a little bit, which tells us this thing could have a window of opportunity down the road. The state of Washington, and these petitions are partially up, and there will be more coming on Monday. The state of Washington, flavor ban, tax increase, and a freestanding bill that threatens the tax cap in the state of Washington. And we've had conversations with our retail partners in the state of Washington on that. Flipping back to the Midwest just a little bit because it wasn't on my January 6th prediction list. Today we got notice of a tax increase bill being introduced in the state of South Dakota. And we've had great talks with our partner, Jim Clark, with the Ohio Association regarding a tax increase proposal in the state of Ohio under Governor DeWine's administration. Still concerned about local authority and flavor ban legislation in the state of Oregon. And I'll close off with our efforts in the state of California. You and I had a productive productive conversation, a presentation with some of our distribution partners in the state of California with the Attorney General's office recently regarding this regulatory process on setting up an unflavored tobacco database. So we're working with our California partners on that regulatory measure and hoping nothing else silly comes out of their legislature in this coming year. So I think that's around 20 some states, 21 states possibly. Again, we refer everybody to cigaraction.org. It was updated over the last 24 hours with some of the legislation that I reeled off, and there'll be about another half dozen to a dozen pieces of legislation in the coming week, all at cigaraction.org. And other than that, Josh, there's not a thing going on.
Certainly a ton of activity at the state level, and those action alerts that you receive as retailers and employees of retail stores, feel free to share those on social media, share them with your customer list, put Cigar Action on your website. It's important that we grow the Army, vocalizing the defense of the premium cigar industry and premium cigar brick and mortar. On the association front, I think it's also important to note that the PCA will be awarding several state grants later this month. We renewed that. Our board of directors renewed that last year as part of our annual budget, as well as helping with some startup costs for new state associations, which it's positive to say. Glenn, how many new state associations do you think will be forming this year?
Oh, probably on the new front, probably a half a dozen. That'll put us at close to 26 nationwide, if I remember correctly. They've been incredibly helpful instruments. There are boots on the ground. Sky Regina giving testimony in Virginia. I could go around the country pointing to the leadership of the retail community. Because as we well know, we cannot have boots on the ground in every state or even every region at this juncture. But when you've got, Feeney Helmuth spending months on end on a legislative study group for a cigar bar bill in the state of Maryland, it's indicative of the leadership that's coming out of our retailers to play a part in the legislative process. And again, I could go around the country and point. I was just on the phone over the last 24 hours with Joe Arundel of Rain City Cigars in Seattle regarding the legislation out there. There's a conduit to the retailers in every state where we've got issues that are on Cigar Action. We cannot thank those retail partners enough for the leadership role that they're playing in the legislative process.
And many of them have, set up their state associations where they're raising money and paying their own state lobbyists. So it's a complement of the volunteer leadership working with somebody where there is boots on the ground. And I think the goal for the PCA and our state association programming is to facilitate that, to ensure that we have volunteers, we have a communication system that flows back up to Glenn. We can share the resources and trends and what we're seeing in one state and another with that state association leadership. As we get into trade show season in April, we will be renewing our state association meetings. We'll provide space at the show for people to come together, and Glenn and I will present some basic government affairs strategies. But, we want to set these associations up where they can also raise funds for themselves. And pay for boots on the ground lobbyists, because I think the most compelling thing, especially at the state level, is when you have an actual practical small business owner, retailer, working in unison with professional staff. So that's where we're seeing the trend of the most success on positive legislation. It's a lot easier to fight negative legislation, which we do. There's a lot of bad bills out there, but one of the things where you and I have come in and have spent a lot of time and effort, along with our volunteer leadership and board, is looking for proactive legislation that actually helps retailers, that helps small businesses. And we're doing that on the federal level as we look at for tax breaks or tax incentives for small business, not necessarily all tobacco oriented. So I think that that's important to keep in mind as well.
Well, I think a couple of examples of this on the proactive front is the state of Missouri, where the retailers are coming together to support the legislation that prevents local governments from passing laws and ordinances stronger than that of the state. The same type of approach in North Carolina, the proactive approach on tax caps that Virginia and Nebraska and New Jersey and New York have all exemplified. Again, I can go around the country, every region, every state that's noted on Cigar Action, and point to the leadership out of our retail community, out of our state associations, where the political network is bona fidely growing and becoming ever more sophisticated every year in every legislative season that goes by.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us for our brief state update. Glenn and I will continue to keep all of you informed. Obviously, you saw our communications at the federal level on the flavor cigar rule, as well as the appellate court decision. And I've done a podcast each week for the past 2 or 3 weeks discussing some of the ins and outs of that, but also at the federal level, want to make everyone aware that our federal team has done over 40 educational meetings with congressional offices, and we'll be hosting an event on Monday for the Hispanic Lobbyists Association, and we will also be hosting an event for the Congressional Cigar Caucus. In coordination with the Congressional Cigar Caucus, there'll be a panel on Capitol Hill and then a reception at our office alongside Cigars for Warriors. So really trying to build some deeper connections in other committees like Veterans Affairs, and using that cross-sectional with the partnership. I know that Cigars for Warriors does incredible work, and we're proud to support them and work with them on this event. Glenn, any last words before it's premium cigar time? I have not had one yet today, and it's been a busy day.
Yes, please. I'm glad Antoine put it up there. Get involved today at cigaraction.org. Monitor it. Please just go to it weekly, but mainly make sure you distribute that link to your state, to your customers from your given state. There's no better way to influence the legislative and political process than for legislators to hear from their constituents. And if they hear, you and I have been in these offices at state and in Congress for a lot of years, and I tell you what, people think I'm joking when I tell them this, but there's somebody at those desks answering those phones that's keeping tracks of the yays and nays. Somebody's always checking yes and no. And where were you from my given district? And they're watching it, and that makes grassroots outreach an ever more important part of the process.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a great weekend.